On a January morning in 1945, a young American engineer from the 291st Combat Engineer Battalion walked into a field 2 miles south of a Belgian town called Malmedy. The snow had begun to melt. He was in his 20s, he had seen combat, he thought he had seen everything. He counted 84 bodies, American, frozen where they had fallen, some of them face down, some on their backs, arms still raised, locked in the posture of surrender. One man was curled around another as though he had tried in his last seconds to shield someone he did not know. The engineer did what he had been trained to do. He knelt beside the first body and reached for the dog tag. There was no dog tag. He moved to the next body, then the next, then the next. Someone had walked through this field before him. Someone had knelt beside these men while they were still warm and had taken the small metal rectangles that carried their names. This is the story of those tags. It is the story of the 4 minutes in which the men who wore them were killed. It is the story of the general who read the report 3 days later in a farmhouse in France and gave an order he never wrote down. And it is the story of what happens when a war ends before justice does. Let us begin with the general. In December of 1944, George Smith Patton Jr. was 59 years old. He was the son of a Virginia lawyer and the grandson of a Confederate colonel who had been killed at Winchester. He had graduated from West Point on his second attempt, having failed mathematics the first year. He had served under Pershing in the punitive expedition in Mexico in 1916. And had led one of the first motorized combat actions in American military history. He had been wounded in the Meuse-Argonne in 1918. He believed in reincarnation. He believed he had been a Roman legionnaire. He believed he had died before at Cannae, at Crécy, at Gettysburg, and would die again in this war. He was also a man who had recently disgraced himself. In August of 1943, in a field hospital in Sicily, Patton had walked into a tent and found a private named Charles Cool sitting on a cot. Cool was 26. He had no visible wound. When Patton asked what was wrong with him, Cool said, "I guess I can't take it." Patton called him a coward. He slapped him across the face with a leather glove. Then he drew him out of the tent by the collar and kicked him. A week later, in another hospital, Patton did it again. The soldier's name this time was Paul Bennett. He was crying. Patton hit him twice with the glove and threatened to shoot him with the ivory-handled Colt revolver he wore at his hip. The story reached Eisenhower. It reached the press. Patton was made to apologize publicly in front of every division he commanded. He was passed over for the invasion of France. For 7 months in 1944, one of the most aggressive field commanders in the American Army sat in England as a decoy, commanding a fictional invasion force designed to fool the Germans. He was, by his own admission in his diary, a man who believed he had been born for a moment that might now never come. Then came Normandy. And when the American breakout stalled at St. Lo, Eisenhower gave Patton the Third Army. And from August of 1944 until the following spring, Patton did what Patton did. He advanced. By December, his Third Army was in Lorraine, pushing east toward the Saar. He was fighting Germans, and he was fighting the weather, and he was fighting his own supply lines, which stretched 400 miles back to the beaches. He was tired, he was cold. He was most of all unaware of what was about to happen 100 miles to the north of him, in a forest that Allied intelligence had described, in the second week of December, as quiet. The intelligence chief at Supreme Headquarters was a British Major General named Kenneth Strong. He was 54 years old, a career soldier who had served as a military attaché in Berlin before the war and who spoke fluent German. He was one of the most respected intelligence officers of the Allied command. In the first week of December 1944, Strong's analysts reviewed the German order of battle opposite the Ardennes sector. They noted the presence of Waffen-SS panzer divisions being refitted in the region. They noted increased rail traffic. They noted a strange radio silence. And they concluded that the Germans were resting. They were not resting. 24 German divisions were massing behind a curtain of fog and forest and radio blackout. 200,000 men, 1,000 tanks and assault guns, approximately 1,600 artillery pieces and rocket launchers. The plan was called Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine, and its objective was to punch through the American line in the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River and take the port of Antwerp, splitting the British and American armies in two. It was the last German offensive in the West, and no one on the Allied side saw it coming. This is the first thing to understand about what is about to happen. The men who died at Baugnes did not die because their commanders were reckless. They died because the entire Allied command had been told, by the best intelligence apparatus in the world, that the sector they were driving through was safe. They were sent forward on a promise. The promise was wrong. Now let us turn to the German. Joachim Peiper was born on the 30th of January 1915 in Berlin. He was the youngest of 3 sons. His father had been an infantry officer in the First World War. His eldest brother Horst died on the Eastern Front. His middle brother Hans Hasso, an SS officer, killed himself in 1941. Peiper joined the SS at 18. He was tall, blond, articulate, well-read. He spoke passable English. He read Nietzsche and Ernst Jünger. He carried throughout the war a small volume of the poems of Stefan George. In 1938, at the age of 23, he became the personal adjutant of Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer of the SS. He travelled with Himmler. He took notes at Himmler's meetings. He was present when Himmler toured the concentration camp at Dachau. He was present when Himmler visited the death squads operating in Poland in 1939. There is no evidence that Peiper was ever disturbed by anything he saw. In 1941, he requested combat duty. He was given command of a company in the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Hitler's personal bodyguard division elevated into an armored formation. He fought in Russia. He rose quickly. By 1943, at 28, he commanded a battalion. In September of 1943, in the Italian village of Bouvres, Peiper's battalion killed at least 23 civilians and burned much of the village. The killings were carried out in retaliation for the ambush of 2 of his men. Peiper was investigated after the war. He was never charged. By December of 1944, he was 29 years old, held the rank of SS Obersturmbannführer, wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves at his throat, and commanded the armoured spearhead of the entire Ardennes offensive. His task was simple. Cross the Meuse in 24 hours. Reach Antwerp in 7 days. Do not stop. He was, by his own later admission, the wrong man for the job. He said in captivity that he had told his superiors the roads were too narrow, the fuel too limited, the schedule impossible. They told him to go anyway. At 5:30 in the morning on the 16th of December 1944, roughly 1,600 German guns opened fire along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. American soldiers in foxholes who had been told the sector was quiet woke to a wall of noise they had not heard since the last war. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, 4,800 men, 72 tanks, and roughly 100 other armoured vehicles began to move west at dawn. He was 16 hours behind schedule by nightfall. The roads were narrow, the tanks were heavy, the fuel was running out. A German soldier who did not have gasoline was, in December of 1944, a soldier who had already lost. Peiper's orders were to capture American fuel dumps as he advanced. He did not know where they were. He was moving blind, on ice, in fog, with the largest concentration of armour the Waffen-SS had assembled in the West. By the morning of the 17th of December, he was pushing his column through the villages of Honsfeld and Büllingen. In Honsfeld, his men killed 19 American prisoners. In Büllingen, they killed at least 50 more. These killings do not appear in most histories of the campaign. They happened. They were documented after the war. But they were not, at the time, widely known. What was about to happen at a crossroads 5 miles to the west would be different, because there would be survivors. Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion was not a combat unit. The men in it were observers. Their job was to watch where enemy artillery shells landed, calculate the position of the guns that fired them, and radio the coordinates back so American artillery could destroy them. They carried carbines and pistols. They had 1 machine gun in the entire convoy. They were, in the language of the American Army, non-combat personnel, which meant they had not trained for what was about to happen to them. The convoy consisted of about 30 vehicles, jeeps, trucks, a single armoured car. The battery commander was Captain Roger Mills. His executive officer was First Lieutenant Virgil Larry. Larry was 26 years old, from Kentucky. He had been in the army for 3 years and had never fired a shot in anger. On the morning of the 17th of December, Battery B received orders to move from Schevenhütte in Germany to Sankt-Vith in Belgium, to support a defensive line that was already collapsing. They were told to travel via Malmedy. They were told the route was clear. The route was not clear. At approximately 12:45 in the afternoon, the lead vehicles of the convoy reached the crossroads at Baugnes, 2 miles south of Malmedy. It was snowing. Visibility was under 50 meters. The temperature was -8 degrees Celsius. Coming down the road from the northeast, invisible in the trees until it was on top of them, was the point element of Kampfgruppe Pieper. The first shots came from the lead German tank, a Panzer IV firing high explosive into the trucks at the front of the American column. The trucks caught fire. The men inside them, those still alive, jumped down into the ditches on either side of the road. Within 10 minutes it was over. The American convoy was destroyed. About 113 men, most of them wounded or dazed, threw down their weapons and raised their hands. The Germans marched them into a field on the south side of the road. The field belonged to a farmer named Henri Le Joly. It was flat, snow-covered, bordered by pines. There was a small cafe at one edge of the field, run by a 58-year-old widow named Adele Bodawe. The Americans were told to stand in the field with their hands up. Pieper's own tank continued west without stopping. He did not remain at the crossroads. This detail, which seems small, would become one of the central questions at his trial, because what happened next was not, strictly speaking, ordered by him. It was ordered by a man riding in a half-track behind him. SS Sturmbannführer Werner Petschke was 30 years old. He commanded the 1st Panzer Battalion of Pieper's Kampfgruppe. He had been in the SS since he was 19. He had fought in France, in the Balkans, in Russia. He had, in the words of one of his own men later, a face like something carved out of a frozen river. When Petschke's half-track reached the crossroads, he found approximately 113 American prisoners standing in a field, guarded by a handful of German soldiers who did not know what to do with them. Pieper's column was moving. It needed to keep moving. Prisoners slowed everything down. Prisoners had to be fed, guarded, transported to the rear. Petschke gave an order. The exact words are disputed. What is not disputed is what happened next. He turned to a 21-year-old private named Georg Fleps. Fleps was an ethnic German from Romania, from the town of Sibiu. He had joined the Waffen-SS in 1943. He was riding in a half-track at the front of the group, holding a captured American pistol. Petschke told him to shoot. Fleps raised the pistol. He aimed at an American soldier standing at the front of the field. The man's identity has never been established with certainty in the official record. Fleps fired. The bullet went into the soldier's chest. He fell, and then the machine guns opened up from the half-tracks along the road. We will come back to the field. We will come back to the 4 minutes during which 113 unarmed men were fired upon at a range of 30 meters by SS machine gunners who did not stop until nothing in the field appeared to be moving. We will come back to the men who lay in the snow with their eyes open, holding their breath, listening to the sound of German boots walking among them, and the small sharp sound of pistol shots as SS soldiers moved from body to body, killing anyone who groaned or shifted. We will come back to the survivors. There were more of them than the Germans knew. In the confusion of a mass shooting on open ground, some men fell before they were hit. Some played dead so convincingly that they were walked past. Some crawled, in the last minutes before darkness, into the pine trees at the edge of the field. One of them made it 3 miles through the snow to the American lines at Malmedy that night. His feet were frozen. His voice was gone, but he spoke long enough to say what had happened. The report reached 1st Army headquarters at 14:30. It reached 12th Army Group by nightfall, and within 24 hours it reached a 59-year-old general in Lorraine who had spent his entire career believing that war had rules, and who was about to be told that the men opposite him had decided it did not. The story of what Patton did next is not the story of a man exacting vengeance. He never touched an SS officer. He never fired a shot in that war. The story of what he did is quieter and stranger and in some ways more terrible. But before we can tell it, we have to walk into the field with the men who did not walk out. The snow was still falling at Baugnies when Pieper's column moved on. The field behind them was silent. Farmer Le Joly stood at his farmhouse window and watched. Adele Bodawe stood in the doorway of her cafe and watched. What she saw, she would tell no one, because within days she too would be gone, and no body would ever be found, and no explanation would ever be given. 113 men had walked into that field. 84 would not walk out, and somewhere among them, on the ground, in the snow, on the frozen chests of men whose families did not yet know they were dead, small metal tags stamped with names and blood types and serial numbers were being pulled loose and put into pockets. Someone was collecting them. The war had 28 more days to run before the snow gave up what was under it. The war for the truth of what happened here would run for another 80 years. The first minute in the field belonged to the machine guns. There were 2 of them, mounted on half-tracks along the road. MG-42s. The German infantry called them Hitler's saw because of the sound they made. 1,200 rounds a minute. So fast the human ear could not separate the shots. It was one long tearing sound, like canvas ripping, but longer and lower, and it did not stop. The Americans in the field had no cover. The ground was flat. The snow was ankle deep. There was nowhere to run. Some of them stood for a moment, hands still raised, as though the guns might yet change their minds. Some threw themselves down before they were hit, hoping the ground would take them before the bullets did. 22-year-old Ted Paluch from Philadelphia was near the middle of the group. He was a private. He had been in the army for 11 months. He had left home the previous winter, and his mother had made him promise to come back. He remembered the promise as he went down. He said later that he made himself think of nothing else. Not the man beside him who was screaming. Not the wet warmth spreading across his own leg where a round had gone through the muscle. Only his mother. Only the promise. 23-year-old Sergeant Kenneth Ahrens from Missouri went down early. He took a bullet through the back, low near the spine. He felt it as a heat, not a pain, and then he felt the cold of the snow on his face. And he understood that the only reason he was not going to die in the next 30 seconds was that he had fallen among other men who were already dead, and the machine gunners had moved on. 26-year-old First Lieutenant Virgil Larry, the executive officer of Battery B, went down without being hit. He fell because the man in front of him fell, and because he understood, in the half-second before he hit the ground, that the only chance any of them had was to become indistinguishable from a corpse. He lay in the snow. He did not move. He listened. The machine gun stopped after about 3 minutes. There was a silence then that was almost worse than the noise. The men who were still alive lay in it, breathing shallow, keeping their eyes almost closed but not quite, because a closed eye is a living eye, and the SS knew that. Then they heard the boots. Small parties of SS men walked out into the field. They walked between the bodies. They carried pistols. When they came to a body that groaned or twitched or exhaled too loudly, they leaned down and put the pistol behind the ear, and they fired. Ted Paluch heard it happening. He heard a shot, and then another, and then a third, moving down the road toward him. He counted them. He could not stop counting them. He held his breath so long that when he finally let it out, he thought it would sound like a train whistle. It did not. It sounded like nothing. The boots walked past him. The pistol did not fire. He was alive. Virgil Larry heard the boots too. He heard them come very close. He heard a German voice say something short and low, and then the sound of a pistol being cocked, and then, for reasons he never understood and never explained, the sound of the boots walking on. Kenneth Ahrens felt a boot touch his hand. He did not move. The boot moved on. At the far side of the field, someone laughed. That is the detail that survived the trial. It is the detail that survivors testified to in 1946, sitting in a courtroom at Dachau, 5,000 miles from their homes, being asked to remember what they had spent 2 years trying to forget. Several of them independently remembered laughter, young men's laughter, the kind of laughter that comes after a difficult thing has been done well. There was also, at some point during those minutes, a sound that was not laughter. It was the sound of small metal being touched. An SS soldier, or several of them, walked among the bodies with something in his hand. He knelt beside men who were dead, and he pulled at the chains around their necks, and he took the dog tags off. Not all of them, not systematically, but enough that when the Graves Registration Company came back to this field 28 days later, they would write in their report the sentence that has haunted this story ever since. Many of the tags were missing. We do not know what happened to those tags. We have never known. The men who took them either died in the last months of the war, or made it home to Germany and told no one, or carried them until they died, or threw them into a canal somewhere on the retreat. They took them. That is a fact, and it was that fact, when it reached George Patton, that turned something in him that had not been turned before. At around 3 in the afternoon, in the falling light, some of the men in the field began to move. They moved because they had understood, lying there, that the SS were leaving. The column was rolling west. The engines were fading. The last of the guards had climbed back into their half-tracks and were pulling away toward Les Neuville and the road to the Meuse. Ted Paluch got up first, or thought he did. He ran. He did not know where. He ran into the pine trees at the south edge of the field and kept running. His leg no longer hurt. He would find out later that a bullet had gone all the way through the meat of his thigh and missed the bone by a centimeter. Virgil Larry rose next. He ran the other way toward the road, toward what he thought was the direction of Malmedy. He ran with his hands still slightly raised, as though there were still guns pointed at him. Kenneth Arends rose more slowly. His back would not straighten fully. He would carry the wound for the rest of his life. He would live to be 89. He would die in Missouri in 2010, having spoken publicly about that field only a handful of times in 65 years. About 43 men made it out of the field alive. Some ran into the woods, some ran into the cafe. The cafe was a mistake. The cafe belonged to WWII. She was 58 years old, a Belgian widow, and by the accounts of the few people who knew her, a quiet woman who kept her opinions to herself in a village that had been occupied twice in her lifetime. When the shooting stopped, a small group of surviving Americans, perhaps 8 or 9 of them, took shelter in her cafe. They did not know what else to do. They were freezing. They were bleeding. Some of them could barely walk. An SS patrol saw them go in. The SS came back. They set the cafe on fire. They stood outside with their weapons and they waited. When the Americans tried to come out, they shot them. When the fire had burned down and the German column had moved on, the cafe was a black shell. Inside were the bodies of the American soldiers. And of Adele Bodaway no trace was ever found. She had been a witness. She had stood in her doorway and watched what happened in the field. She had seen the faces of the men who did it. She was never seen again. Her body was never recovered. No German soldier was ever charged with her death. She is not counted among the 84 dead at Baugnez, because officially no one knows what happened to her. Officially. But there are things that everyone knows without being told. The men who ran into the woods had 3 miles to cover. 3 miles in fresh snow, in the falling dark, in temperatures below zero, with wounds most of them had not yet felt. The forest sloped gently upward toward the town of Malmedy. There were German patrols in the woods. They did not know how many. They did not stop to find out. One private, whose name is now on a granite marker at the crossroads, made it a mile before he sat down against a pine tree to rest. He did not get up again. He was found the next spring. Virgil Larry made it. Ted Palach made it. Kenneth Arends made it. 27 of them, in the end, reached the American lines that night. The first of them stumbled out of the trees at Malmedy at around 4:30 in the afternoon. He was found by an engineer sergeant from the 291st Combat Engineer Battalion. He was crying and could not speak. When he finally did speak, what he said was not sentences. It was words: field machine gun, field machine gun. The sergeant took him to the battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel named David Pergrin. Pergrin was 32 years old. He was a Pennsylvania State University engineering graduate. He would later write a memoir of the winter of 1945, and in it he would say that the sound of that man's voice was the sound that changed the war for him. By 6 that evening, Pergrin had radioed 1st Army headquarters. By 8, 1st Army had radioed 12th Army Group. By midnight, the word Malmedy had begun to travel through the American Army in a way that few words had traveled in that war. By the morning of the 18th of December, it had reached the 3rd Army in Lorraine. It had reached Patton. We need to leave Baugnez for a moment. We need to follow the column that did the killing, because that column was not finished. Pieper's Kampfgruppe rolled west that afternoon and that night. They passed through Ligneuville, where they shot 8 more American prisoners in a hotel courtyard. They passed through Stavelot on the morning of the 18th, and there they shot Belgian civilians in the streets. Old women, children. The exact count is disputed. The lowest estimate is 130. Some historians believe it was closer to 200. They did not shoot these people for military reasons. Stavelot was not resisting. The civilians were shot because they had been seen, because they were there, because the column was moving fast and could not spare the time to be careful about who lived and who did not. Elsewhere in the Ardennes, other elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division were doing similar things. On the same day as Baugnez, another SS detachment captured 11 African-American soldiers from the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion in the Belgian village of Wereth. Those 11 men were taken to a field outside the village. They were beaten with rifle butts. Their fingers were broken. Their skulls were crushed. Their bodies were left in the snow. They were not found until February. The report of what had happened to them was classified and remained classified for 50 years. There is a monument to them now in Wereth. It was built by a Belgian farmer in his own field with his own money in 1994, because for half a century no one else would build it. This is the context in which the news of Baugnez reached Patton. It was not one atrocity, it was a pattern. It was a decision, made somewhere in the SS command structure, that this offensive would be conducted without rules. On the 18th of December, in his headquarters in Nancy, France, Patton received the report. He wrote in his diary that night, "The entry has been published. Anyone can read it. It is short. The Germans," he wrote, "are murdering our prisoners." That was all. 6 words. There is no exclamation, there is no outrage. There is only a fact written down by a man who had spent his whole life expecting that war would be terrible, but had believed until that morning that it would still be war. The next morning, at a place called Verdun, he sat down at a long table with Eisenhower and the other American army commanders. The meeting at Verdun on the 19th of December 1944 was one of the most consequential meetings of the Second World War. The situation was catastrophic. The German offensive was 3 days old. It had punched a hole in the American line 80 miles wide. 2 American divisions had ceased to exist. A third was surrounded at a town called Bastogne. If the Germans reached the Meuse, they might well reach Antwerp. If they reached Antwerp, the war might not end in 1945. Eisenhower went around the table. He asked when each of his commanders could counterattack. Most of them said weeks. Some said longer. He asked Patton. Patton said 48 hours. There was a silence in the room. Some of the officers present later wrote that it was the kind of silence that comes when a man has said something so absurd it cannot be answered. Some laughed openly. Eisenhower did not laugh. He looked at Patton for a long moment and he said, "Don't be fatuous, George." Patton was not being fatuous. He had prepared. In the 3 days since the offensive had begun, his staff had drawn up 3 separate contingency plans for the Third Army to disengage from its current front, wheel 90 degrees, and drive north into Belgium. He had already given the initial orders. He had already moved the fuel. What he was proposing to do was, by the standards of military planning, impossible. He did it anyway. Over the next 48 hours, the Third Army disengaged 3 divisions from active combat in Lorraine, turned them 90 degrees to the north, and moved them 100 kilometers over icy roads in freezing fog. 19,000 vehicles, 100,000 men. It is still studied in war colleges. It is still, 79 years later, considered one of the greatest feats of operational movement in the history of modern warfare. On the 22nd of December, elements of the 4th Armored Division under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams began the drive on Bastogne. On the 26th of December, they broke through and lifted the siege. But that is not the moment we are following. The moment we are following is a smaller one. It happened on the 21st of December in a farmhouse in Luxembourg that Patton was using as a forward command post. He had been thinking about Baugnes for 3 days. He had received the survivors' initial testimony. He had read the report of the first American engineers who had reached the outskirts of the crossroads and been driven back by German fire. He had read the intelligence assessment of the 1st SS Panzer Division's conduct at Honsfeld and Büllingen. He knew by the 21st what kind of enemy his men were now facing on the northern flank. Late on the 21st, according to the recollection of Colonel Paul Harkins, who was Patton's deputy chief of staff and who was present, Patton called in the commander of the 4th Armored Division. He gave a verbal order. It was not put on paper. It was not signed. It appears in no official document. The order was this: no member of the Waffen-SS was to be taken prisoner. Any who tried to surrender were to be shot on sight. Harkins wrote about it years later, in his memoirs. He was uneasy about it, even in retrospect. He noted that Patton did not repeat the order in writing. He noted that it was never formally rescinded. He noted simply that it existed, and that the men in the 4th Armored knew about it, and that in the days that followed, in the fighting around Bastogne, when SS soldiers were captured, some of them survived and some of them did not. We do not know how many, the records do not exist. Reports of prisoners taken were not broken down by unit affiliation. What we know is that the SS learned, in the last weeks of December, that surrendering to Patton's army was not the same as surrendering to a British soldier or to a soldier of the First Army further north. We know that when Kampfgruppe Pieper finally collapsed, Pieper himself did not try to surrender, he walked out. By the 23rd of December, Pieper's tanks had reached a village called L'Aglise, 20 miles short of the Meuse. He had lost more than a third of his armor. He had almost no fuel. American resistance had stiffened in front of him and thickened behind him. He was, though he did not yet know it, finished. On the 21st of December, an American officer had walked into Pieper's captivity by accident. His name was Hal D. McCown. He was a lieutenant colonel, 29 years old, from Louisiana. He commanded the 2nd Battalion of the 119th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Infantry Division. He had gone forward at night to check on a platoon and had walked into a German patrol. He was taken to Pieper's command post in the cellar of the Château de Fracourt outside l'Église. He was held there for 3 days. And on the night of the 22nd of December, Pieper came down to the cellar and sat with him, and they talked. They talked for most of the night. This is one of the strangest documented episodes of the entire Ardennes campaign, and it is well documented because McCown wrote a report about it after his escape, and the report survives in the National Archives. Pieper asked McCown what he thought of America. He asked what he thought of the future of Europe. He asked what he thought of the war. He spoke, McCown wrote, calmly, without ideology, without cruelty. He offered McCown a cigarette. He offered him a drink. He said, at one point, that Germany had already lost the war, and that the men now fighting for her were fighting because it was too late to stop. McCown listened. He said very little. He did not tell Pieper that he had heard about Malmedy. He did not tell Pieper what he thought of the man sitting across from him. He watched. He remembered. In the pre-dawn hours of the 24th of December, Pieper made the decision to abandon l'Église. He had no fuel. His tanks would not move. He gathered 800 of his men on foot and prepared to walk back through the American lines to the German positions in the east. He took the American wounded who could walk. He left the American wounded who could not. And in the confusion of the withdrawal, at some point in the darkness, Lieutenant Colonel Hal McCown slipped away from his guards and made it back to American lines. He would testify against Pieper. He would also, in ways that would later shock the American public, testify for him. That is a story for another part of this film. It matters here only that Pieper walked out of l'Église on foot in the early hours of the 24th of December, having left behind 135 tanks and half-tracks in perfect working order, undestroyed, undamaged, out of fuel in the snow. The armoured spearhead of the German army in the west had been defeated not by tanks, not by artillery, not by air power. It had been defeated by an empty gas can. On the 14th of January 1945, 28 days after the killings, elements of the 1st Infantry Division and the 291st Combat Engineers moved south from Malmedy and retook the crossroads at Baunez. The snow had covered everything. What they were looking for was under it. They brought up mine detectors. They walked the field in slow lines. When a detector clicked, they marked the spot with a small red flag, and they moved on. By the end of the first day, there were dozens of red flags in the field. Then they began to dig. The bodies came up slowly, frozen, preserved almost perfectly by 28 days of below zero cold. Many of them still had their hands raised, the fingers curled toward the palm, the arms locked in the position they had held when the machine guns opened up. Some of them were identifiable by their faces. Many were not. The 3060th Quartermaster Graves Registration Company came forward with clipboards and canvas stretchers. Their job was to record every body, catalogue every personal effect, and match every dog tag to a name. They did their work in silence. At the end of the third day, the officer in charge, whose name is on the report but whose personal papers do not survive, wrote a sentence in the company log that has been quoted in every serious history of Baunez ever written. He wrote that many of the identification tags were missing. Of the 84 dead, only 43 could be identified by tag. The other 41 had to be identified by other means, by dental records when they existed, by letters in their pockets, by a wedding ring engraved on the inside, by a photograph of a girl in one case with a name written on the back. For those 41 families the news came slowly. Some of them waited into February, some into March, some received the wrong news first and had to wait longer for it to be corrected. A mother in Ohio received her son's photograph in the mail before she received the telegram, and she did not understand what it meant until a chaplain came to her door. The photograph was one that had been in his pocket. It had been found on the ground. It had not been on his body when they lifted him. Someone had gone through his pockets, taken the tag, taken the wallet, and dropped the photograph in the snow. That was Baunez. That was the field. That was what the men who did it left behind when they moved on. And somewhere on the road east, in the days after Christmas, in the retreat back to Germany, in the failing light of a war that everyone now knew was lost, someone was carrying those tags. We do not know who, we do not know how many, we do not know what they intended to do with them, but we know they were carried. And we know that in the last weeks of the war, in April of 1945, as the Third Army rolled east across Bavaria and Saxony, and as SS men in the thousands began to strip off their uniforms and try to disappear into the mass of surrendering Germans, the question of what those tags meant and what it meant to have taken them had not been forgotten. Not by the men who had made it out of the field, not by the men of Graves' registration who had written the sentence in the log, and not by the general who had read the report on the 18th of December in Nancy, and had written 6 words in his diary, and had turned his army north the next morning, and had given a spoken order that no one had ever written down. The war was almost over. The reckoning had not yet begun. On the 9th of December 1945, a black Cadillac staff car was moving north along a road outside Mannheim, in the American zone of occupied Germany. The war in Europe had been over for 7 months. Berlin had fallen, Hitler was dead, the camps had been opened, and the world had begun to see what had been inside them. The men of the Third Army were going home in waves on troop ships, back to Ohio and Pennsylvania and Georgia and Kentucky, back to wives who had aged, back to children who did not recognize them, back to farms and factories and small towns that had also been changed by the war in ways that would take years to name. George Patton was not going home. He was 60 years old. He had been relieved of command of the Third Army in October after giving a press conference in which he compared denazification to a political fight in America and suggested, in language that shocked the reporters, that the Nazi Party had been no worse than the Democrats and Republicans back home. He was a man of another century. He had said what he thought, and what he thought had ended his career. He was now the commander of the 15th Army, a paper command whose only real task was to write the history of the war he had fought. He hated it. He had told friends he would resign in the new year. He had told his wife he wanted to come home. That morning, the 9th of December, he had planned a pheasant hunt outside Mannheim. He was riding in the back of the Cadillac. His driver was a 19-year-old private named Horace Woodring. In the front passenger seat was Major General Hobart Gay, one of his oldest friends. They were driving through the ruins of Kaffetal, a suburb of Mannheim, past piles of rubble that had once been houses. A US Army 2.5-ton truck coming the other way made a sudden left turn across the road. Woodring braked. The Cadillac struck the truck at low speed, perhaps 20 miles an hour. Neither the truck driver nor the front seat passengers were injured. Patton was thrown forward. His head struck the metal partition between the driver's compartment and the rear seat. His neck broke at the 3rd cervical vertebra. He was paralyzed from the neck down. They took him to the US Army hospital at Heidelberg. He was conscious. He could speak. He could not move. Doctors from London, from Washington were flown in. His wife, Beatrice, flew from Boston, sitting for 18 hours on a military transport, arriving in the middle of the night, walking into a hospital room where the man she had married was strapped to a striker frame with weights hanging from his skull. He was calm. He was, according to every witness, more thoughtful in those days than he had ever been in his life. He talked with his wife. He talked with his chief of staff. He listened to the doctors explain, in careful English, that even in the best case he would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair, unable to feed himself, unable to hold a pen. He said at one point, "This is a hell of a way to die." He said it without self-pity. He said it as a man says a fact. On the 21st of December, 1945, at 5:55 in the evening, in the hospital at Heidelberg, George Smith Patton Jr. stopped breathing in his sleep. He was buried on Christmas Eve in the American Military Cemetery at Hamm, in Luxembourg, at the head of a row of 5,076 soldiers of the Third Army who had been killed in the Ardennes and the Rhineland. He had asked to be buried among them. His widow honored the request. He was 59 days short of his 61st birthday, and he had died 5 months and 8 days before the trial began. The trial began on the 16th of May, 1946. It was held on the grounds of what had been, until the previous spring, the concentration camp at Dachau. The Americans had turned the SS troop barracks at the edge of the camp into a courthouse. The defendants were housed in what had been an SS training facility. From the windows of the courtroom, if a man stood at the right angle, he could see the roofs of the crematoria. There were 74 defendants. All of them had served in the 1st SS Panzer Division. Some had been at Baunez. Some had been at Honsfeld, or Bullingen, or Stavelot, or Wereth. Some had been officers, some had been privates, some had been 19 years old at the time of the killings. The oldest, Hermann Press, the division commander, was 44. Sitting among them, in the second row, wearing a plain grey suit that the American authorities had provided him, was Joachim Pieper. He was 31 years old. His hair had begun to grey at the temples. He had spent the previous year in American custody, being interrogated, being moved from camp to camp. He had put on a small amount of weight. He was, by the accounts of the men who saw him in that courtroom every day for 8 weeks, calm, attentive, almost detached. He took notes. The chief prosecutor was a 41-year-old lieutenant colonel from California named Burton F. Ellis. Ellis had been a civilian lawyer before the war, a decent man, methodical, careful, not given to speeches. He had inherited the case in early 1946. He had spent 5 months preparing it. He believed, when the trial opened, that the evidence was overwhelming. The chief defense counsel was a 45-year-old lieutenant colonel from Georgia named Willis M. Everett Jr. Everett had been assigned the case against his will. He had never defended a criminal charge in his life. His practice before the war had been in real estate and corporate law. He had told his superiors when he received the assignment that he could not do it. They had told him he had to. He would spend the rest of his life on it. The prosecution called Virgil Larry on the 4th day. Larry was 27 now. He had grown a mustache. He was still thin. He walked to the witness stand with a slight limp that no one had ever explained. He was sworn in. He looked for a long moment at the row of defendants across the courtroom. He recognized 2 of them. He testified for most of the day. He described the convoy. He described the crossroads. He described the field. He described the moment when the pistol fired at the front of the group and the machine guns opened up from the road. He described lying in the snow with his face turned to one side, listening to the boots, listening to the pistol shots, holding his breath until he thought his chest would burst. He did not weep. He did not raise his voice. When Ellis asked him if he could identify any of the men who had been at the crossroads that day, he pointed at a defendant in the 2nd row. He pointed at a young man with a thin face and light hair. He said, "That one, he was in the half-track." He fired the first shot. The defendant's name was Georg Fleps. He was 23 now. He had been 21 at Baugnes. He was, by the standards of the courtroom, a small man, a private, a follower. The court would sentence him to death. Ted Palach testified on the 6th day, Kenneth Ahrens on the 7th. 22 survivors in total took the stand. Their testimony was consistent. It was detailed. It was in every meaningful way corroborated by the physical evidence and by the confessions of the defendants themselves, many of whom had signed statements during interrogation admitting to being present at the killings. On the 16th of July 1946, after 9 weeks of testimony, the tribunal delivered its verdict. Of the 74 defendants, 73 were convicted. 43 were sentenced to death by hanging. 22 were sentenced to life imprisonment. The remaining 8 received sentences of 10 to 20 years. Joachim Peiper was sentenced to death. Mann Friss was sentenced to life. Werner Puechki was not present, having been killed in the last weeks of the war. Georg Fleps, the 21-year-old who had fired the first shot, was sentenced to death. The men in the courtroom stood as the sentences were read. Peiper stood without expression. He had known what was coming. He had been told the night before by his defense counsel that death was near certain. He did not flinch. The families of the 84 dead, most of whom were in America and could not attend, received the news by newspaper and radio. For many of them, it was the first time they had felt anything like closure since the telegrams had come in January of 1945. They believed the story was over. It was not over. Willis Everett, the defense counsel, had spent the trial believing that his clients were guilty of terrible crimes. But he had also, in the weeks before the trial began, spoken privately with dozens of the defendants in their cells. He had heard, from man after man, the same story. It was told in different words, by different voices, with different details. But it was the same story. They had been beaten during interrogation. They had been hooded and struck in the groin and threatened with hanging. They had been made to stand in front of mock tribunals presided over by interrogators in black robes, who told them they had already been condemned to death and that their only chance of leniency was to confess. They had been shown false statements from other defendants and told that if they did not corroborate, they would be killed. Some of them had been Jewish refugees' interrogation subjects, and the interrogators had been Jewish. Some of them had been ordinary German soldiers, and the interrogators had been American MPs. The methods, they said, had been the same. Everett listened. He was, by inclination and background, a man who did not want to believe what he was hearing. He was a Southern Baptist. He was a career lawyer. He was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. He did not want to believe that his own government had done what these men said had been done, but he began to keep notes. And after the trial, when the death sentences came down and the men he had defended were transferred to Landsberg prison to await execution, Everett did what almost no one in his position would have done. He filed an appeal. He filed it first with the Army. The Army rejected it. He filed it with the Supreme Court of the United States. The court declined to hear it by a vote of 4-4, with one justice recusing. He wrote letters. He spoke to reporters. He testified before a Senate committee. He argued, in every forum he could reach, that the evidence used to convict the men of Malmedy had been obtained by torture, and that the trial had therefore been a fraud. By late 1948, an American Army panel, the Simpson Commission, had confirmed a portion of his claims. Mock trials had occurred. Physical mistreatment had occurred. Not every allegation was proven, but enough were proven to matter. And then, in 1949, the case attracted the attention of a young Republican senator from Wisconsin. His name was Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy would, within a year, become one of the most feared and hated men in American political life. But in 1949, before the anti-communist crusade that would define him, he was a freshman senator looking for a cause. He had heard about Malmedy. He had heard that some of the interrogators had been Jewish refugees from Germany. He believed, with a certainty that had less to do with justice than with prejudice, that the Malmedy defendants had been framed. He held hearings, he shouted, he accused, he made allegations that were sometimes true and sometimes false, and were almost always presented with more anger than evidence. But he was heard, and by the time the noise around him died down, none of the 43 men who had been sentenced to death for the killings at Baunjes and Honsfeld and Stavelot and Wereth would ever be hanged. The sentences were commuted one by one, to life, then to 30 years, then to 20. Joachim Paper's sentence was commuted from death to life in 1951. His life sentence was commuted to 35 years in 1954. On the 22nd of December 1956, he walked out of Landsberg prison a free man. He had served 11 years and 4 months for the deaths of 84 American soldiers, and for the deaths of an unknown number of Belgian civilians, and for the deaths of 11 black American artillerymen at Wereth, and for the death, we may assume, of a Belgian widow named Adele Bodaway, whose body was never found. He was 41 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. He did what men like him did. He tried to disappear. He took work as a translator. He wrote occasional pieces for right-wing German veterans' publications. He kept in touch with his old comrades. He was proud of what he had done in the war. He said so, more than once, to journalists who tracked him down over the years. He did not apologize. He did not express regret. He said that he had been a soldier, and that soldiers followed orders, and that history would have to judge whether the orders had been just. In the mid-1960s, he left Germany. He moved with his wife to a small stone house in the village of Traves, in eastern France, in the department of Haute-Saône. He worked from home. He translated technical documents from English and French into German. He kept to himself. His neighbors did not know who he was. For 11 years he lived there quietly. He gardened. He walked in the woods. He was in his early 60s. He had begun, according to letters that survive, to think of himself as an old man who had outlived his war. Then, in June of 1976, a French communist newspaper published his name and his address. They published a photograph of him. They published a photograph of his house. They wrote that Joachim Peiper, the SS colonel of Malmedy, was living quietly in a French village less than 50 kilometers from where he had once fought. The village was in 1976 a village of former French resistance fighters, men in their 50s and 60s, men who remembered Boves, men who remembered Oradour, men who did not need to be told what an SS colonel had done in the war because they had lived through it. Peiper received threats. His house was defaced. His wife left the country. He was urged by friends in Germany to leave immediately. He did not leave. He wrote in a letter to a former comrade that he had run from no man in his life and that he would not begin now. On the night of the 13th to the 14th of July, 1976, Bastille Day, someone came to the house at Traves. Or several men came, we do not know. No arrest was ever made. No confession was ever offered. No investigation ever produced a suspect. They came in the night. They forced their way in. Peiper was armed. He fired at least once from a hunting rifle. The gunfire was heard by neighbors. Then the fire started. It burned through the night. When the fire brigade arrived, the house was a shell. Inside, on the floor of what had been the living room, they found a body. It was so badly burned that identification could be made only by dental records. It was Pieper. He was 61 years old. He had died the way 32 years earlier so many of his own victims had died. In a fire at night by the hand of an enemy he had made. No one in France was ever charged with the killing. The French police investigated for some months. They spoke to former resistance fighters in the region. Some of them smiled. None of them talked. The case was closed without a suspect. It has remained closed. Bastille Day in France is the anniversary of the storming of a prison in 1789. It is a day that commemorates, more than any other, the moment when ordinary people rose up and settled a long account with those who had oppressed them. Whoever came to Piper's house that night chose the day. Ted Pollock lived a long life. He married. He had a son. He worked. He rarely spoke of the war. When he did speak of it, in the last decades of his life, he spoke of it in short sentences. He was interviewed once, in his 80s, by a documentary filmmaker. He said, when asked what he remembered most clearly about that afternoon in the field, that he remembered his mother. He died in Pennsylvania in 2011, at the age of 89. Kenneth Arends died the following year, in Missouri, at the same age. He had spent the last decades of his life participating in reunions of the survivors, of whom there were fewer every year. He said in one interview that he had made a decision, in that field, to survive. He said he had never fully understood, in the years that followed, why he had been able to and others had not. Virgil Larry died in 1993 in Kentucky. His obituary mentioned the trial. It did not mention the field. Hal McCown, the officer who had spent a night in a cellar with Pieper, testified at Dachau on Pieper's behalf. He told the tribunal that Pieper had treated him with courtesy. He said that Pieper had not been the man he had expected to meet. His testimony did not save Pieper's life at trial, but it may have played a small part in the long process by which the sentence was reduced. McCown rose to the rank of Major General in the U.S. Army. He died in 1988. He did not, in the years available to us, ever speak publicly again about that night in the cellar. Willis Everett, the lawyer who had spent his career defending men most Americans wanted dead, returned to Atlanta after the war. He resumed his practice. He did not become famous. He did not seek publicity. He died in 1966 at 66. His son later said that his father had never fully recovered from the case. He had believed until the end of his life that the American army had committed injustices in the pursuit of justice, and that those injustices had made the justice worse. He may have been right. The question of Malmedy has never been fully closed. There are historians who argue that the confessions were valid, that the physical mistreatment was minor, that the men convicted were guilty. There are other historians who argue that the entire proceeding was tainted, that the sentences were unjust, that Pieper and his men, guilty as they may have been, were denied a fair trial. Both sides can point to evidence. Neither side has ever fully won. We began in that field. We began with 84 American soldiers frozen under the snow, and a young engineer kneeling beside them looking for names that were no longer there. We do not know what happened to those tags. We do not know how many were taken. We do not know who took them. We do not know whether they were kept as souvenirs, or discarded on the retreat, or buried in the rubble of a German city that no longer exists on any map. We know only that they were taken, and that the men whose names they bore had families in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Georgia and Kentucky, who waited into the spring of 1945 before they knew for certain that their sons and their brothers and their husbands were dead. Some of them received a photograph in the mail before they received the telegram. Some of them received nothing but a wedding ring in an envelope and a chaplain at the door. The men who did the killing at Baugnez were tried. Most of them died in prison of old age, quietly, in their beds in the 1960s and 70s. One of them died in a burning house in France. The rest walked out of Landsberg prison in the 1950s and went back to their lives. The general who read the report in Nancy and turned his army north the next day never lived to see the trial. He died before Christmas of 1945 in a hospital bed in Heidelberg of a broken neck. He was buried at the head of 5,000 of his soldiers. The 84 men in the field at Baugnez have a monument now. It stands at the crossroads. It lists their names. All 84 of them, including the 41 who could not be identified by their tags. Their families gave the army the names. The army carved them into the stone. If you go there today, 79 years later, you can stand at the monument and read them. The wind in December blows across the field the way it did then. The trees look the same. There is a farmhouse near the road that has been rebuilt, and a cafe that has never been rebuilt, and a small path through the pines that leads down toward the town of Malmedy. There are no dog tags in the snow. There is only the stone and the names and the silence. Somewhere in a drawer, in a box, in the pocket of a dead man in an unmarked grave, there may still be 12 or 20 or 40 small pieces of American metal, stamped with the names of the men who died in that field on the 17th of December 1944. They were carried a long way from home. They have not, as far as anyone knows, ever come back.